Hello everyone, today we talk about the Kingdom of Mercia existing from 527 to 918 AD, known in Old English as Mercna Rica, in Latin as Merciorum Regnum, one of the three main Anglic realms founded after the settlement of the Anglo-Saxons in sub-Roman Britain, and thus standing out as one of the most powerful and the earliest most powerful in, say, at least before the rise of Wessex. There were other Bretwalda at some point, claiming an hegemonic rule, right, on the Anglo-Saxons and beyond, but not as much as Mercia, and for the time, right, that this power lasted, that they could do so. Mercia was centered geographically on the River Trent Valley, right? Plus, of course, the tributaries to this broader basin, right, in the region that we know as the Midlands in England. When we look at the name of Mercia, we can identify the same etymology of mark, right? So borderland, right? And that was the case for the same Mercian Old English Mercia, right, which eventually was, of course, Latinized into Mercia. The kingdom was known, in fact, as Mercia, or Mirce, like spelled either M-I-E-R-C-E or M-Y-R-C-E, in the West Saxon dialect. The historical name and the broader legacy of Mercia lived on after its end because of the, of course, relevant role that the Midlands had politically and culturally, for example, towards the Saxon monarchy in the south, general rivalry that in fact existed between the two areas we will see now, and there will be a lot to digress on in those videos about Norman and Angevin England. We have observed how essentially the greatest problems put to the Saxon monarchy, right, at least the monarchy that was based on the south of England, were exactly from these areas, and how, of course, this corresponds to a different level of development, a different, say, cultural influence, and general desire of autonomy that eventually was, in fact, won over at some point, mostly during the same in a sense of political independence, at least, even before the Norman conquest, right? But you can see these things going on systemically, and so that's evidently not a coincidence. So that throughout English history, many, aside from the area, like from the historical name of the region, but say different communities, entities, institutions still bear the name of Mercia, even the ensign, at least in what for what it was established later. And this power in early medieval times was typical for the era, but also having some sort of specific characteristics that distinguished it from the rest of the Anglo-Saxon realms. So, as it was normal at the time, the royal court was itinerating, right? There was no such thing like a true fixed capital, even though England with London historically would develop for reasons of, say, cultural, say, national compaction. The earliest one, even before London, is an older capital than Paris, right? Showing, say, the importance of its centrality through, for example, the establishment of a chancery, of an early center of administrative center. If we could identify the same for Mercia, in spite of all, this would be Repton, that, as we will see, was founded from some of the earliest ruler of the land, that are also actually the only ones that dynastically trace an origin to the same Jutland Peninsula. And we know this also because of the documentation of the royal estates that existed in great number around this city. According to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, it was in Repton, in fact, that the great heathen army marched and deposed the king of Mercia in 873-74. This is basically the destiny of the Midlands. They're mostly overrun by the Danes. And slightly earlier, the famous King Offa, the greatest of the Mercian monarchs, seems instead to have favored another center, Tamworth, right? Repton is in southern Derbyshire, Tamworth in Staffordshire, so essentially northeast of Birmingham. And there was some continuity in residence, right? Tamworth was where, for example, Offa was crowned, and also he spent many Christmas during, in fact, after the campaigns in the cold season. So when you look at Mercian history, it's actually an impressively continuous degree of power wielded, and also from a significantly early time, especially considering the extension of Mercia that was essentially the largest, right, territorially speaking, of the Heptarchic power. Naturally, there were many more than 7, as you know, especially of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, especially at the beginning, right? So the role of Bretwalda, so this sort of imperial authority of Britain, as we will see, was very parceled, and power was not that stable. And that's why it stands out that a land that was not more developed than the south, for example, managed to wield such great military power. And part of the reason, I think, is that it exactly could provide to the, say, this various, but the nobility that run Mercia, some common goal, right, as far as the tribute that they could levy, right, through deterrence and bullying, fundamentally, on the southeast, right, that had this early moment of importance, just because, of course, most Anglo-Saxons had also just landed there to spread in the rest of Britain, but because, of course, these remain sort of the richer areas, and the north remained somehow more primitive, but in this sense, also considering the divide of the hinterland, again, Mercia being quite extended, and say that the Saxon south being somehow more compressed between that and the coast, you can realize being also more fragmented along the coastline itself, with this central continental, let's say, speaking of still within the island of Britain, power which was, again, not as primitive as Northumbria, that in fact was not included, famously enough, in the possessions of Mercia, but did create some more than a problem, let's say, to it. But eventually the Mercians were not interested in expanding Northumbria. It was a place where they knew there was less, and so they mostly, yes, would fight with them routinely, but not quite to distract themselves from the richest and more politically fragmented areas. But everything is very intertwined in this regard. So we're looking essentially at 300 years of history, something between 600 and 900 AD, which historians have called Mercian Supremacy, where you find, in fact, 5 of the other 6 major realms of the Anglo-Saxon Heptarchy, namely East Anglia, Essex, Kent, Sussex, and Wessex. And I made a video about the first 3. By the way, we need here the let's say the central, the southern, the western Saxons, but we'll get there hopefully soon. Dominated by Mercia, right? So factually making this country dominating south of the Humber estuary, and during King Offa's reign, also a system, let's say, of containment towards the Celtic kingdoms, the Romano, but let's say the Welsh principalities, especially the one of Gwynedd, being further, say, in part attacked, but also contained physically through the defense that revolved around so-called Offa's Dyke, which, again, tradition says, well, it was created by Offa. There are similar, we've seen it in the video for Schleswig-Holstein, also the Dannevirke. Like it's those times in which such major defensive infrastructures could be developed as a support for an army, naturally, because alone they couldn't stop really anyone. But that, archaeologically, with the most updated technologies, we know having been started at least from the 5th century AD, which is fascinating because it matches with the chronology we've seen often in the videos about the Celtic range of, let's say, sort of Celtic coming back, right, in terms especially of raids, for which naturally this infrastructure, like some part of the Roman limes, let's say, were conceived, right, to present with some continuous fortification that the raiders should have broken through first, then after having looted within, not necessarily having the time to break it in another section, so having to come back in the point they had broken in so that it could be ambushed at Similia. Offa's Dyke would establish some further historical boundary between England and Wales. I made a video about Edward I's conquest of Wales, by the way, but we will come back on that. There is a lot about Welsh warfare that I have already made and that we will keep making. In any case, there is no doubt that Mercia dominated the Anglo-Saxon world largely until the 9th century, right? And there is even some historiographical debate regarding whether the Mercians were the actually first, let's say, unifier, at least of, say, in a broader and looser political and territorial sense, of England herself, right, rather than the Saxons, which is fascinating because under Offa, objectively, that major, at least as far as this central southern Anglo-Saxon world where it was concerned, Northumbria being a bit a thing on its own, you could claim that Mercian hegemony. King Penda converted to Christianity around 656. For this, we can say that religion arrived slightly later in this land than in the rest, especially of the southern Anglo-Saxons. The diocese of Mercia was founded in the same year. The first bishop was Duma, and his diocese was Repton. Right. Christianity was thus, say, maintained without substantial problems from the late 7th century at the latest, and in 669, Saint Chad was the 5th bishop of Repton, moved, however, the Mercian bishopric to Lichfield, right? Because this functioned essentially at that point as the diocese of, as the center of the diocese of Mercia, right? It was only one, right, overall, and that's where it still stands, right? At least the diocese of Lichfield, as others came by later on. And we know that in during the late 8th and the beginning of the 9th century, the diocese of Lichfield was elevated to an archbishopric. As we have seen, the Viking invasion of the Great Eden Army at the end of the 9th century inflicted a very heavy blow to Mercian power, given that most of the country was absorbed in the Danelaw, right? And there were, as we will see, some broader reasons, including the say, the rivalry with the emerging Saxon South brought some of this is the same for the Northumbrians, as a matter of fact, to side with peoples like the Vikings, the Celts, etc., against what was becoming England, as a matter of fact, that would, however, stand its ground and fundamentally manage to at least develop as a country on its own. Doesn't matter how Anglo-Danish de facto it would become later on, because of the sort of decline of, say, privatization of the, say, Anglo-Saxon government especially in the 11th century. So that's quite a complicated history that we haven't seen well yet, but we really must make too many other videos on it to do it satisfactorily. Consider that the Danes at some point controlled even London. We've seen it in the video about East Anglia, the latter's area entirely, and most of the north of England. Right, the last Mercian king, proper Ceolwulf II, died in 879, which definitely corresponds to the collapse of a sort of of an independent Mercian state. Right, it's a big word considering, for example, what this early, now high medieval powers had become to substantiate themselves like, was again really the Saxons who were developing faster. But it's equally important because from there on Mercia would never quite reacquire a true political capacity on its own, right? At least as a power. It was ruled at that point by say some important Anglo-Saxon noblemen or elder men, right? So, say, could be someone even of royal birth, right? But that was considered still independent of a king, right? So this would fit the relatively decentralized nature of this land, especially after it had become de facto the frontier between the Danelaw and the Saxons, at least in the northwest. It fell under the overlordship of Alfred the Great, who styled himself finally as King of the Anglo-Saxons. And even though there was some period of further, autonomization, especially at the beginning of the 11th century, there was not really much that the area required in power with the rise of Wessex. Mercia as a kingdom, that was a term that had remained institutionally, became formally an earldom until 1071, right? And the Earl of Mercia is a title also in the late Anglo-Saxon, Anglo-Danish, and early Anglo-Norman period of English history. We will see this at some other point. In any case, looking at the beginnings, right? Mercia is a bit of a mysterious land, honestly, because we know paradoxically more about Northumbria, in part thanks to Bede, but say this is a problem, of course, for the broader Anglo-Saxon reality, like how did these kingdoms come to be practically. It's mostly shrouded in legend and or even sometimes properly lack of any satisfactory information. We know more about Kent, Wessex. Mercia, however, and this is the striking aspect, developed an important political capacity while becoming Christian even later than other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. And this tells you how, say, relatively similar, paradoxically, the Anglo-Saxon powers were, especially these ones, say, in the center and the south, because normally what you see is that those who Christianized the earliest were also the greatest powers, right? The ones that had a sort of greater development center in terms of public and, say, central authority of some sort. here the picture is complicated by the fact that the Saxons were mostly some sort of Frankish client states. Also, the previous reason I provided, right? This sort of interland that resisted, say, the external influences, and that exploited the political fragmentation of the richer areas to unite and to sort of keep on inflicting attacks or drawing tributes from there. What you see in the end of Mercian history, as we just observed, is that they collapsed anyway, and the south rose. But for a long time, right, this space of the slow development of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, you have paradoxically a pagan and mostly continental. Well, okay, everybody here was more or less continental, was much of a naval power in general, but say less exposed, less open, less sort of international power could exert a greater force on these other sort of more civilized areas. Naturally, again, this could happen because there wasn't much of a difference actually between the various Anglo-Saxon kingdoms compared to, say, other stages of development in Europe, in continental Europe. We see that the Angles settled the lands north of the River Thames by the 6th century, definitely. Mercia, as we've seen, is a term that refers to the fact that the people who settled there were inhabiting a frontier of some sort. And initially it was believed that this referred to the position of the Saxons to the Welsh marches in the west, but it seems more likely that the border between Northumbria and Mercia, so the Trent River Valley constituting this frontier, right, and or at least becoming the mark as such, right, perceived from also the more, again, primitive Northumbria and so on. We're not informed, though, on the initial boundaries, because it is true that the Angles did spread, say, mostly from, yes, the south, but also the east, right, to west, so areas that had been inhabited by the Celts remained for some time, like mostly in the western part. And it's interesting, in fact, that the Mercian center of power was closer geographically to, in fact, Wales than say other parts, for example, in the east, right? Or, for example, some greater coastal center. Even though, this doesn't mean that there were so many better options in that phase. But it's important to observe how the centrality of the frontier probably conferred, both in the north and in the west, Mercia, some greater methods of hostility and so some greater political cohesion, right? Because yes, this state was successful, but we see, of course, how long they fought against their foes in order to maintain that power, also offensively, but still, right, evenly, as there was some greater disturbance, right, against them hadn't they acted themselves. From the tribal hive age, that, as you know, is one of the most important documents for Anglo-Saxon history. That's basically a list of 35 tribes that that are listed in their properties, in their lands, and so on, and compiled sometime between the 7th and the 9th century, but still, in fact, so relatively vague, but still the ones of Mercian hegemony. We are told that the community known as the First of the Mercians covered much of the shires south of Derby, Leicester, Nottingham, Northampton, Stafford, and Warwick. This is fundamentally the core, it seems, as we've seen also with the capital and the capitals, in an approximate sense, they're the core of this power laid in. The first king of Mercia emerging from the documents is Creoda. There were surely other chiefs within the same Mercia. Again, there were many different petty kingdoms that eventually constituted the main powers of the what we call the Epitharchy. But this guy belonged essentially to the same dynasty, the Icelings, that we can track back to, in fact, the continental Germanic background. This is the exception, right, in the entire Anglo-Saxon Epitharchy, right, where we know that a ruling house was to claim themselves, right, the direct family link with the pre-migration people in the Jutland, right. This Creoda was said to have been the great-grandson of Isel or Ikel, right, the son of Eomer, the last king of the Angles in Angeln. We will talk about them at some other point for ancient history, but this is a relevant point because it shows that those who migrated to establish eventually the Mercian power as a dynastic monarchy were evidently already powerful in back in the continent, so they weren't just like some random newcomer that had emerged randomly in Britain itself, but there was surely a power continuity of this house. This doesn't mean, of course, that there weren't other pretendants, that there was some fierce fight for maintaining this prestige, this status, but they made it, and this fits a bit the warlike character of the Mercian monarchy historically. Creoda is also the one that, having come to power around 584, built the fortress at Tamworth, right, in Staffordshire, that became at that point the seat of the Mercian kings. He was succeeded by his son Pibba in 593, while Cierl, that was Kierl, there are different ways, I will be butchering the original Anglo-Saxon pronunciation, that these are just normalized, sort of the properly modern English terms, but we say at least there would be some philological property that I do not own as far as this background is concerned. In any case, this guy was a kinsman of Creoda, so part of the same Ikelingian clan. He was followed by the aforementioned Pibba again, so there were some, of course, alternations in power. Cyril gave his daughter Quemburga in marriage to Edwin, that was at the time the ruler of Deira, that had been an area of post-Roman Britain and now become an Anglian kingdom. The point here is that Cyril had sheltered Edwin while he was an exiled prince, and this already shows some political machinations aimed at extending essentially Mercian power in the surrounding countries. And it's obvious that, of course, this land would be aware, let's say, of its potential, especially towards such turbulent surroundings. Penda was the following Mercian ruler, reigning from about 626 or 633 until 655, right? And Penda was not lucky as far as his historical figure is concerned, because he was mostly documented by his enemy Bede, right? That was not just, of course, a Christian, describing here a Mercian pagan ruler, but also an enemy of Mercia as a Northumbria. Bede, however, points out, especially as far as the religious side of the story is concerned, that Penda was fairly pragmatic. He allowed, for example, the Christian missionaries from the Lindisfarne into Mercia. So this, accepting them in from there, that Britain was at some point witnessing a more Christian north, at some point from the Scots, then than from the Anglo-Saxons themselves. So there was some, of course, Northumbria medium as well that favored, spread at least the evangelization of Mercia. In fact, Penda is said by Bede not to have obstacled these preaching, right? And probably he understood, as many other Anglo-Saxon leaders, and that there had always been this moment of crisis by some degree, that after all, right, Christianity favored the affirmation of some more stable institutions and structures, and so on the longer run there was not much that could be done independently from what these individuals believed personally, which is another story. But I made something about the evangelization of the Anglo-Saxons and explaining a bit the mechanisms, but they're much more politically intricated than, say, a positively definable, as far as an opposition between Christianity and paganism specifically is concerned. Edwin, that had become the ruler of the newly unified Northumbria and also Bretwalda, or High King over the southern kingdoms, was defeated in 633 by Penda and his allies, Welsh ally Cadwallon of Gwynedd, in the north of Wales, the more developed part. This is interesting because there is a sort of early Midland plus Welsh attempt, right, which is a systemic dynamic to eventually work toward a sort of English monarchic project of sorts, naturally in very different circumstances from the ones that would occur half of a millennium later. But still, right, because you could expect the Welsh just to be opposite to these powerful eastern neighbors, and even though, of course, there was some degree of dependency on the latter, you can see that there was a greater attention to the British situation as a whole, and Mercia was evidently posing itself in an monarchic project, as far at least as they were not the Bretwaldas. Northumbrian power was not broken, though. At this time, you could have these battles, right, being fought, of course, creating some generational trouble, engulfing the various countries of the Heptarchy into some phase of political turmoil. Everything was, at this point, still, especially in this more northern area, coalescing in terms of political power and cohesion. But this also meant that battles were often, somehow more limited in political and strategic impact. Northumbria rose up again under the new King Oswald, the famous saint, right, that, so a particular cult Europe-wide during the Middle Ages. And Oswald claimed, again, overlordship of the South. You see how truly imperial Anglo-Saxon mindset was from the very beginning. That this is not the very beginning, but I mean, these peoples understood immediately that their goal was to secure the control on all Britain, right, and even the British Isles in general. Like the imperial reference even to some Roman or Byzantine models. There are some Anglo-Saxon kings in the 10th century that signed themselves as Basileus, right? Not even imperator, right? Literally inspiring themselves to Constantinople. And here with Oswald, we don't have to think to be that distant, right? But at least there was still relative uncertainty regarding the Christianization, the let's say, the general future of these lands, and was this clashes arose also, and mostly internally, right, to eventually identify in the outer in this outer neighbors. In fact, the an objective it could allow, if struck, to consolidate internally. And here the Mercian resilience and power unitly is reconfirmed as Oswald was defeated and killed, allegedly at the hands of the very Penda and his allies in the Battle of Masorfield in 642. Right, this phase of Anglo-Saxon history is beautiful because it's sort of still of a hybrid between, say, Odinic and evangelic symbolism, right? Crosses, crows, and as we have explained countless times in the history of religion, there's really synchrosis, not just in the outcome, but in the very origins. Actually, this was the overall, right, universal creed. It was just declined differently from culture to culture, right? And the word likeness, but the idea of sanctity, of salvation, of military prowess, right, is extraordinary. We've seen it with Saint Olaf. With these were all individuals whose lives we had witnessed were not necessarily that sort of peaceful, right? At least in the ideal that Christ didn't quite need that to take over the world, but in more concrete terms, that's also how these rulers were conceived, right? They had the mission of giving stability to the world by taking it over. In 655, when Northumbria was engulfed in further internal struggles due also to these defeats, the king of Mercia, Penda, brought 60 petty kings to fight under him the new Northumbrian ruler Oswiu, which brought to the Battle of Vinvad, in which, however, the Northumbrians were victorious, and King Penda, as well as his ally Ethel here of East Anglia, we've seen it in the video about East Anglia, were killed. Right. This caused, in turn, a collapse in Mercia instead. Right. Penda's son Peda had, at this point, taken the step to convert to Christianity, which he did in Repton in 653, as we remembered before. He succeeded his father Penda, but at that point Northumbrian influence was so strong that Oswiu set him up as a sort of subject, and the thing ended badly, as in the spring of 656 Peda was assassinated and Oswiu took over the control of Mercia, which, needless to say, was a hell of a power overall if it wasn't for the fact that, of course, it wouldn't last long in this way. In fact, in 658 you have a Mercian revolt that managed to kick out the Northumbrians and to place on the throne another son of Penda, that is Wulfar, right? He was actually the first Christian king of all of Mercia, right? Albeit we do not know exactly when he converted from Odinism. He managed to rule Mercia as an independent kingdom. Seemingly, the odds between them and Northumbria were balanced. Albeit it seems that he did keep paying some tribute to the Northumbrians for a while. This would belong even to the policy of a more powerful power, right? Just to keep the neighbor at bay. So we do not have there exactly the the quantities that would bring now a recovering Mercia to prevent the Northumbrians to launch raids, even invading, for toppling the Mercian regime, etc. Wulfhere died in 675. He was basically the guy who restored a bit for good, like the power of Mercia, right? There was, however, at the end of his reign, yet another defeat inflicted to the Mercians by the Northumbrians. Wulfhere was succeeded by Aethelred, who ruled between 675 and 704, who was the son of Penda as well. He managed to crush the Northumbrians in 679 at the Battle of Trent. We're talking about, again, relatively modest forces, apparently not more than a few thousand per side, right? But very heavy casualties. So here we're looking at some of the finest forces of Anglo-Saxon Britain really beating the hell out of each other on the field and settling once for all the long disputed control of what had been the realm of Lindsey, that is to say, the island of Lindum, historically. It had constituted an independent Anglo-Saxon kingdom at some point, but at this point was absorbed by Northumbria. This place was the seat of the ancient colony of Lindum, right, of Roman times, that is today's Lincoln, in Lincolnshire. And the importance of this land was great because fundamentally it allowed the Mercians to connect themselves, or a brief trade, to the North Sea, right, through the Humber estuary, without encountering the swamp or alluvium that mostly stretched from Northumbria, from Deira, that was from the other side of some extensive swamps between Mercia and the North Sea, from, say, the northeast of Mercia and south of Northumbria, up to basically the South Folk, right, the East Saxons, and controlling that allowed to control properly the Humber estuary, and having this access to the sea on the other side. And this victory that would fundamentally settle the matter with Northumbria, of course, shows you how powerful Mercia was beginning to establish itself, right, in a firm, relatively firm, at least territorial frame, right? Aethelred was succeeded by Ceanred, that was the son of Wulfhere. He ruled from 704 to 709. These guys were not known for many other activities but spiritual ones, right? There was evidently a need for internal consolidation after essentially more than a generation of continuous fighting that had exhausted the contendants and finally settled, let's say, the matters for which this conflict had been going on. Ceolred is said in a letter of St. Boniface to have been, however, sort of a bad ruler that, in fact, didn't rule for much. He did so from 709 to 716, as he was youthful and apparently died crazy, at least. So this ended the rule of the direct offspring of Penda, in spite of the quantity of it. There was no continuity. Before the rise of Aethelbald, that was king of Mercia from 1716 until his death in 757, pretty long reign, the Mercians had conquered the region around Wroxeter in the Shropshire. This was at the time a frontier area with the Welsh of Pengyvern that was known as the Paradise of Povus as well. This acquisition brought to some important affirmation of the Mercians in the west, on the Welsh as well. The power that was definitely expanding. Aethelbald had to contend power with other important rulers of first half of the 8th century Anglo-Saxon rulers, Withred of Kent and Ine of Wessex, right? That departed in different ways. Withred died in 725, while Ine abdicated in 726, doing something that basically many, at least Anglo-Saxon rulers would do, that is to say, making a testament and going to Rome to end his life there as a monk, right? This was an incredibly popular thing, again, among the Anglo-Saxon establishment, and were deep contacts with Rome at this point, especially as far as now England was being completely Christianized. Say Wessex, we will look at Wessex more in depth again in another video. Kent had been, an influent kingdom. It had been actually the first one, right? The one not just from which the first Anglo-Saxons settled, but also the actually richest one in relative terms, right? The best connected through the sea with France, the one from which, in fact, most of continental European influence would be spreading in Britain, and it had even extended an hegemony on the surrounding countries of the Epitharchic kingdoms. However, soon its power had left space to, especially after the consolidation of the other of the realms established after the migration. It took some while, considering pushing away the Celto-Romans was not that easy immediately. At least there was, as we've seen, a lot to settle even among the same Anglo-Saxons. It's a very complex picture, because actually most of the population, of course, remained there after the Anglo-Saxon invasion, and they had sort of their own ideas about whom had to rule against whom. There were pre-existing rivalries, etc. In any case, Mercia, as we've seen, begins to consolidate, and these are the, especially in the southeast, the countries that are taken over a bit the earliest, right? The Mercians couldn't quite simply occupy them, but it was enough to just exact tribute and or to appoint the local ruler, right? That would be enough to make your kingdom stronger, and to just show also the others what you were capable of doing. Aethelbald, thus, with the departure of his rivals, managed to establish the Mercian hegemony over the rest of the Anglo-Saxon south of the Humber River. He was, however, defeated by the West Saxons of Cuthred in 752. In spite of this, it seems that the Mercians did restore sovereignty, again at a distance on Wessex, even in 557, showing that, again, this was the mounting moment of Mercian power, and the say this was a phase that in which not even the Saxons had reached a satisfactory cohesion to simply get the upper hand on the Midlands. All right. Throughout this time, we have also very interesting archaeological records. The most famous discovered in 2009 is the Staffordshire Hoard, close to Lichfield. We do not know exactly to when it dates, right? It can be a pretty wide time span, say between the 7th and the 9th century. It is not even clear whether it was a pagan or Christian hoard, and probably even to ask that doesn't make too much sense. At least, of course, there was some uniformity in the various, say, in the community that buried this, but right, the hybrid there was also between the syncresis between the two religions was also somewhat common, right? After Aethelbald was assassinated by one of his bodyguards in 757, a civil war broke out in Mercia, and victorious from it emerged Offa, who descended from Pibba, by the way. Offa was the true builder of the Mercian hegemony that had been established by his predecessor on the south of England. Offa, as we've said, was the greatest ruler of the land. He was militarily active. He managed to keep down the southern Anglo-Saxons. He took an active hand in the administration of his realm. He founded market towns to boost the local economy. He was the first ruler in Britain to issue a substantial amount of gold coins as part of his monarchic policy. This is important because certain gold coins not just kept circulating, of course, in spite of the economic contraction of the early Middle Ages, but some were even, minted, but to some low degree that was reflective of the general limits, in fact, of these rulers' power. Well, Offa is the one that has enough precious metals stored, thanks to his campaign and local production, to, in fact, impress this mark of reliability connected with Mercia and his rule. He was also attentive to the ecclesiastical policy. He intervened, for example, in the Catholic Church of England by sponsoring the short-lived archbishopric of Lichfield, that, as we've seen, lasted as an archbishopric as opposed to just a bishopric that already existed in this late 8th and beginning of the 9th century, also beyond, in fact, Offa's life. Offa was a contemporary of Charlemagne. Needless to say, it was an important connection between the two, because, as we've seen, the Franks had usually credited the Anglo-Saxons as their clients, and the Mercians were enough, say, distant from the channel not to disturb the Franks, so much so that Charlemagne, in order to establish good relations, exchange, etc., treated Offa as an equal, right? The Mercian king was also credited, as we've seen, with the at least implementation of the famous dike that would maintain essentially the line of boundary between Wales and Mercia for an important time. And as we said before, the structure is named after Offa, but it was say a part of some broader system of defense that existed way before even the Anglo-Saxons entered Britain, in that, of course, we must think to have been integrated with other systems of defense, some of which we can't even simply track archaeologically, and it's obvious that a dike would, especially of that kind, right, the Danevirke was more sort of effective as far as the waterways of the Jutland were concerned. Here was a long continental border, and so it functioned in a slightly different way, and of course it was meant to be effective only when supported by an army, right? And the problem was always the same, that technically the Anglo-Saxons were the more civilized in Britain, and as a consequence the Celts at best would launch some sort of raids, right, to harass, in fact, these richer places, but they could suffer pretty heavy retaliatory raids as well, so that this conflict between, say, the Celto-Roman world and the Anglo-Saxon one would remain, even though, of course, the latter would be able to absorb the former, yet after only a considerable amount of time, a good half millennium, by the way. So this is the reason why Offa's dike is there in the first place. That is to say, it's a much older and longer lasting structure than Offa, that surely did implement it further, but was not really the author of, and that other, of course, Mercian kings made use of, by the way, and similarly upkeeping in some way. This tells you again how affluent, right, for the times and places Mercia was, because these structures weren't just maintaining them by themselves. The embankment is still there, but the ditches get filled, the palisades get rotten, and again you must have other points to support the forces that eventually can make use of this dike. So it's a complex matter. Consider that, again, major Welsh invasions were not really taking place. It was mostly about tracking some scoundrel that would sort of infest the marsh. Offa made significant efforts to ensure the succession of his son Ecgfrith, that in fact succeeded him at Offa's death in July 796, except for the fact that Ecgfrith lived only for another 5 months, so that the kingdom of Mercia came to be ruled by Ceanwulf, that in fact was in power from December 796 until his death in 821. This guy was succeeded in turn by his brother Ceolwulf I, who ruled also as king of East Anglia, and that was a pretty good military leader, right? He attacked and destroyed the fortress of Dagenway in Gwynedd to prove, again, what we were saying before, that at every sort of succession crisis, the Celto-Romans thought they could infiltrate, raid, exploit this temporary lack of authority to take some loot home. But that was evidently enough, and the Mercians struck back with heavy force, leaving quite a memory there. At this point, the West Saxons were rising significantly in power. In the 9th century, there is, again, a broader era, right, of prosperity before. Essentially, actually, the Viking raids have just started, but the worst has yet to come, especially for Britain. And it's especially the disintegration of the Carolingian Empire that dragged the same England into the worst, in fact, of the Norse attacks. At this point, the King of Wessex from 802 to 839 was Egbert. And this ruler managed to defeat the Mercian king Beornwulf, who had risen to power by overthrowing Ceolwulf in 883, and that in fact was crushed at the Battle of Ellendon by the West Saxons in 825. He died a year later, which essentially triggered the collapse of Mercian hegemony over the other kingdoms in the Anglo-Saxon heptarchy. There's definitely a watershed here. Ellendon proved that West Saxons were this fresh, more motivated, and somehow more organized, sort of more modern force than the more archaic traditional Mercians had been. This was not anymore the time of how simply cohesive you can be just to exert some cyclical power on the various enemies and having more or less to maintain stability. You had to found a deeper sense of political vision, right, in England, and through the opportunities that just were presenting with the increased importance of say international trade, the closest connection with the continent as well. Politics was becoming ever more at a longer range, at least, and Mercia was too isolated, if you want, right? And Wessex was gradually merging towards a new dawn. The immediate aftermath of the Battle of Ellendon saw Mercia losing control over Kent, Sussex, and Surrey, maybe even Essex. We are not particularly informed about the details here. These powers were, as we've seen, less say important generally. Indeed, just altogether they were a big deal for a single kingdom like Mercia to have been able to subdue, right? But in spite of the local turmoil and the objective difficulty in ruling them directly, right, from the external, they weren't, let's say, polities capable of reasserting a power in among the Anglo-Saxons, right? It was Wessex that would lead that fundamentally. Beornwulf was killed, by the way, as he was taming, in fact, a rebellion among the East Angles that were somehow the more the closest, right, to the early Anglo-Saxons, just by some traditional lifestyle. At least they inhabited some sort of tough grounds, but they were more open to the sea. They were closer, even by ethnic concentration, to the not just to the originary settlers, but to the same Norse that were essentially to attack now Britain from the same places where the Anglo-Saxons had come from originally. Beornwulf was succeeded by a former elderman, right, Ludacam. He reigned only 1 year, and he was killed actually during a revolt himself. So there was another elderman, Wiglaf, that managed to rule only 1 year more his predecessor, before Egbert of Wessex even managed to drive him out of Mercia. So you have the Saxons entering now the Anglo territory and politics, managing to impose this regime change even. In 830, Wiglaf managed to come back to Mercia to maintain Mercian independence, because the Saxons couldn't quite simply take over the kingdom entirely, right? They didn't have the capacity, right, just to do that in a demographic or economical sense. Yet it was evident that, of course, Wessex was rising as the dominant power in England, and that Mercian hegemony on the country had practically ceased. Around 840, Beorhtwulf succeeded Wiglaf at the head of Mercia. This is just for the sake of completion, let's say. Not much, after all, was going on. What really shattered the entire situation for everyone involved, as you can expect, were the Viking invasions, right? In 852, Mercia was ruled by Burgred, that had risen to power that year. Aethelbald of Wessex was subjugating North Wales, essentially passing through Mercia, that had thus become even dependent on the south as far as the defense of its western border was concerned. And these are the same years, however, in which the Danish Vikings occupy Nottingham, right? They had been coming from the North Sea. They had pushed into this area that would be known as the Five Boroughs, right? And so practically seizing the eastern part of Mercia and severing the kingdom in two. This part would become an integral one of the Danelaw, right? Ceolwulf, as we've seen, the last king of Mercia, remained with just the western half. It was technically the most developed, telling you the truth. So, of course, the Vikings had their own limits. They weren't really faring, especially at this point, in a much more satisfactory way than the Anglo-Saxons, right? So that, again, we still have to talk about the later times where, of course, especially the Anglo-Danish period, not the great things would change. So it seems that the Danes kind of succeeded in a broader sense, but it's obvious that we're talking about a military force, but also a pragmatic rule accepted by the English, and that was actually more important in relative terms from the same Danes. At this point, instead, the situation was essentially one of unregulated infiltration by the side of the Danes, that have also to organize themselves satisfactorily in these areas. The collapse of Mercia is exploited by the same Northumbrians, for example, that are taken over, but also mixed with the Vikings. They also let some Celts pouring in to keep fighting against the English. And at this point, Mercia is in the hands of the Saxons, de facto. The western half being absorbed within this monarchic effort to drive the Danes out, and if not succeeding, trying to find a compromise to stop their raids, and so on. So from around 883 until his death in 911, Aethelred, Lord of the Mercians, ruled the country, but on behalf of Wessex, right? So this was not a a king of the Mercians anymore, but some sort of appointee or local ruler that could guarantee the Saxons a political continuity, a loyalty, a cooperation with Wessex. Alfred the Great changed at this point his own title from King of the West Saxons to King of the Anglo-Saxons, in part because of, say, the rule that was exercised on this more important chunk of the, in fact, of England now, that was the western half of the Kingdom of Mercia. Of course, there were the other parts of southern England, not under Danish rule, right? But definitely the Mercians did contribute importantly to that Saxon power as well, because they were the most important chunk after them. The coins struck in Mercia after the disappearance of Ceolwulf in around 879 were all bearing the name of Alfred. This is also another important indicator of political affirmation on a given people, right? Alfred was literally substituting himself to the kings of Mercia, and with the need of cancelling, quite pragmatically and rightfully in that sense, there had been a broader division. Right now, a unitary effort against the invader had to be presented with a, say, unitary face. Aethelred, the aforementioned lord of the Mercians, had, by the way, married Aethelflaed, that became thus lady of the Mercians, and who was the daughter of the same Alfred of Wessex. She took over power when her husband became ill at some point right in the last 10 years of his life, so that she played an important function politically in this frontier, right, with the Danes practically, so not an easy position for sure. Ethelred died in 911. Alfred's successor as King of the Anglo-Saxons, Edward the Elder, took control of important centers in the east like London and Oxford, which had historically been under the Mercian control, and in fact that still Ethelred had as such ruled. Right, at this point it was, as we've seen, Aethelflaed who was still nominally in charge of those places until this switch took place. Aethelflaed and her brother, by the way, remained faithful. They kept helping Alfred, especially in that quite impressive military effort of establishing the various boroughs, especially in the south, but also in some centers in the same Mercia, and these were, as you know, some essentially fortifications, fortified settlements, not particularly different from the minsters conceptually, that had not just to defend the had to be reinforced. Of course, they emerged on the basis of pre-existing settlements, but now they had to be maintained, upkept by the same communities that were by meeting some criteria, right, of work, of garrison, could be dispensed from at least a part of the military service connected with the expeditions that did happen both on land and at sea against the Vikings. And this was a way to fundamentally consolidate control, especially in the south of England, that was also the most easily targeted by the Danes, right? And we will talk about also the military history of that in some other video, because it's very complex, but very, very fascinating. In any case, I made a video about the Anglo-Saxon military organization and beyond, so there is some of that already available on Schwerpunkt. In 918, the Saxon Anglian forces had conquered even the southern part of the Danelaw in East Anglia and in what had been Danish Mercia. So there is a coming back in which you realize that the main effort against the enemy that has to pass through Mercian territory. So also require not just the effort of the population in terms of manpower, what was provided with the usual or emergential means, because actually the ways the Anglo-Saxons levied their forces was pretty homogeneous, but also the extraordinary ones against this new threat that was quite, as you know, quite dangerous to deal with. Aethelbald died in 918. Elfwin, that was Aethelred's daughter, succeeded as, quote, second lady of the Mercians because of the continuity with her predecessor, as if now it had been sort of an acquired right or institutional procedure. However, after 6 months, Edward the Elder had deprived her of all authority in Mercia and had her even taken to Wessex. This was an important political action because, of course, Mercia had lost her independence for a while, but these local figures were trying to hope that there could be some sort of local continuity on a sort of Mercian base. And after the greatest problems against the Danes, now Wessex was showing essentially their interests in the area, and the outcome of that crisis was naturally one of greater dependence of the local inhabitants of constituted power. Anglo-Saxon society was changing, was going towards that gradual erosion of individual freedom, right, that just was automatically coming with the wars, with the crisis, but also with the relatively unchecked affirmation, first of all, of another power within the same England that had at least, in fact, imposed themselves on Mercia, and the relatively unstable situation within the same country, because the consolidation of an English rule now was taking place, but things were not that perfectly stable in the first place. Edward the Elder was succeeded as king of the Anglo-Saxons by his eldest son Aethelstan, who ruled as such until 927, when he proclaimed himself as not king of the Anglo-Saxons anymore, but king of the English. Right? The concept also of territoriality was not around. Some of you ask me, well, why do you title these things, king of the East Angles or whatever? Because that's how they called themselves. It was not about the land. This is a deterior, anti-traditional concept. It was about the people, of course. And this is what, say, at least in the case of Aethelstan, was carried out on a larger level. And the interesting aspect in Aethelstan background is that he had actually been brought up in Mercia himself, right? He was, by the way, immediately accepted as king, in part for this reason, even before Wessex, right, where he was so only 925. He carried out a military campaign that ended up with the conquest of Northumbria, which had been also one of the other big rivals in this scheme, as the Vikings had basically been penetrating from there too. And so this is why Aethelstan crowned himself with the new title of King of the English. All right. In spite of this, Mercia still regained for a brief time, right, some sort of separate political existence, right, from Wessex. This occurred between 955 and 959, when Edgar became king of Mercia, but it was just a short-lived experiment, let's say, that was not really leading much elsewhere, except in 1016, when the kingdom of the English was fundamentally split between Knut the Great and Edmund Ironside, the son of King Aethelred the Unready. The former, right, the Danish king, took Mercia for himself. This is interesting because it still shows that essentially the South had some sort of greater legitimacy, and that Knut, that was actually a good king of England, as you know, had to content himself with that. This fueled some sort of identitary differentiation further. This already existed, right? But of course, the aforementioned political decline and sort of privatization of the Anglo-Saxon world allowed for some sort of even proto-feudal bases that were the same ones for which at the beginning we said, the Midlands fundamentally did remain separated from the South, importantly. Mercia was an earldom at this point, until the Norman conquest in 1066, and as we've seen, that identity lived on, but this was essentially just a profile story of this power that is to be credited with having contributed to the affirmation, at least, of the general principle of Bretwalda, that was to, even if from another basis, ironically, grant England that cohesion that would make it also historically one of the most successful countries. Like, it's difficult to see it as such a long chronological shot, but right, never underestimate that insular sense of, say, national compaction that had stemmed from actually an imperial ideal, so that even continued as a legacy later on in the Bretwalda, in the sense that the Anglo-Saxons had really thought to be, as a people, as relatively loose identitarily at the moment of the migration, but definitely more when they settled in Britain, to have essentially the right to rule over the entire, at least the British Isles, right? First of all, Britain, but at large, right, on the Celtic fringe, and that, after all, managed to preserve itself even after. It doesn't matter how strong the infiltrations of the Scandinavians were, how actually similar these peoples were. They were actually the same ones, but separated just by a few hundred years of migration, but not that much, right? Also considering the broader level of, well, of course, the English were more developed, there is no doubt, than the Scandinavians at that point. There was an important difference. But in fact, this is the point. England did maintain, after all, the upper hand as a system over the, say, ambitions of a Norse world that did as we've seen even recently in the Battle of Largs and other videos about the Kingdom of the Isles and so on, some sort of control on the British Islands, but that could not simply be, imposed on such a fairly developed sort of institutionally and politically aware and also culturally and nationally separated people like the English were becoming. And I think that this would have been the future of England, even if, say, the Normans had not invaded at Similia, so they would have surely remained part of, say, more of this broader world, more similar to the Scandinavians, but they were really already something different, right? Romanization, for example, is something that you cannot quite unsee. As much as the early Christianization, the general proximity to France and more. So there is more to the rediscovering that as opposed to the anti-civilizational concept, right? And say Anglo-Saxon, later Anglo-Danish history is a heavy story, right? It's not a particularly happy one either, right? But you can see in the substratum, after all, the same dynamic that must not be underestimated. Cyclically, we'll talk about all these things in depth, right? Today is just about the regional series as such for the Mercians. For today, however, I stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like. Or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.